he proclaimed himself Prince of Wales.
Assuming the title of Prince of Wales with all its resonance was a momentous step. The Welsh hadn't been ruled by a native prince since the death of this man a century before. He was Llywelyn ap Gruffydd, or Llywelyn the Last, as he's commonly known. So, in claiming the title, Owain Glyndŵr was issuing a direct challenge to Henry IV. And he was telling the world, look, this is no local squabble with the likes of Reginald de Grey. This is a national revolt.
Glyndŵr's act posed a huge challenge to Henry IV, whose grip on his kingdom was very weak in any case, and would remain so for some time to come. The king was on his way to Scotland, hoping to head off trouble there, when news of Glyndŵr's actions reached him. He immediately turned around and headed for Wales. But he took his time getting there, and this gave Glyndŵr a chance. Motivated by natural patriotism, hundreds of Welshmen, mostly from the northeast of the country, had flocked by now to Glyndŵr's side. Over the course of the following week, under his command, these men carried out a series of raids on some of the hated English settlements in northeast Wales. Rhuthun, home of Sir Reginald de Grey himself, was the first town to feel their wrath.
It was market day in the town of Rhuthun when Glyndŵr and his men appeared from nowhere and caused chaos. Rhuthun in those days was a fortified settlement. Glyndŵr and his band of 250 had to disguise themselves to get in, which is what they did. But just imagine the havoc when the disguises came off. The fighting started in the market square, and by all accounts, there were just 3 buildings left standing at the end of the day.
The attack on Rhuthun was rapidly followed by similar attacks on 7 other towns. The September Rampage, as it's been called, took the English by surprise, and they were equally unprepared for what happened next.
By the end of September, some 2 weeks after the revolt had started, Henry IV and his men had reached the border of Wales. They advanced into the country, and of course they expected to meet military opposition at any moment. But they didn't. Glyndŵr and his men were nowhere to be seen. They'd vanished. In fact, they were up in the mountains, where they felt very safe and very secure, and where they knew the English would be very nervous of pursuing them.
In fact, the mountains of Wales would play a key part in Glyndŵr's strategy from now on. He and his men would retreat to them whenever the going got tough, then they'd sweep down from them whenever their enemies least expected them to appear.
Glyndŵr realizes that utilizing the countryside, which he knows far better than an English king, utilizing the landscape in that way, in a guerrilla fashion, is the way to deal with a large, well-armed English army. Glyndŵr's armies, or forces, are relatively small in number. They can move quite rapidly, whereas a lumbering, very large English army can move slowly. And as a result, whenever the king himself takes an army into Wales, he gets a bloody nose.
The first fruitless encounter with Glyndŵr and his men bred a mood of despondency among King Henry's troops, and that mood deepened as they beat a retreat from Wales in October 1400. Horrendous weather was the main cause. Thunder and lightning, accompanied by heavy rain, sometimes turning to snow, dogged the English soldiers every step of the way. And this seems to have convinced them that this mysterious Welshman, called Owain Glyndŵr, could make the very elements obey his commands.
What people believe is perhaps more important than what actually happens on the ground. And this idea that he could control the weather and so on was certainly useful to Glyndŵr. Wales has got lots of weather. If you can control the weather, you can really undermine an army. And this idea did come through, and clearly was a very real folk myth, right through to the time when Shakespeare is writing his Henry IV and his Henry V 200 years later.
Interestingly enough, when the English labelled Glyndŵr a sorcerer, they might not have been all that wide of the mark. Yes, of course, he was very educated, but he was also steeped in the ancient beliefs of the Welsh people. He might well have seen magic as one of the tools at his command. But of course, the military training he'd received while serving the English crown would be much more use to him at the end of the day than the so-called black arts.
You have a lot of class, stand. Forthwith mail, with your turn your nose on that with.
Displaying a sound grasp of military tactics, he and his men sat out the winter of 1400 in a camp that they'd made for themselves high on the slopes of one of the biggest mountains in Wales. Glyndŵr's sudden disappearance convinced Henry IV that the rebellion had come to an end. It was perhaps a reasonable assumption, but it was wrong. By the spring of 1401, the revolt was back on again. And for those who knew Glyndŵr well, that was not a surprise. What was a surprise was that this new onslaught wasn't led by Glyndŵr himself, but by a pair of brothers from northwest Wales, from Gwynedd. Those brothers were called Rhys and Gwilym ap Tudur ap Goronwy. They were great friends and allies of Owain Glyndŵr. And what they did here at Conway Castle on Good Friday in 1401 was inflict a very serious defeat on the English. The soldiers of this apparent stronghold were at prayer, the Welsh attacked and captured the castle. Needless to say, it was a bit of an embarrassment for the king and for his advisors, and it reminded them that Mr. Glyndŵr was still in business. There was more to come.